The world was a chaotic nightmare of churning water and crushing muscle. Jedediah Stone charged into the shallows, his heavy axe held high, a desperate roar tearing from his throat. Before him, a monster from a forgotten age, a colossal python, had coiled its monstrous body around his horse. Ghost. The magnificent white stallion, his only friend in the world, was being squeezed to death, its terrified screams choked into ragged gasps. The serpent's scales, wet and glistening, were like a suit of impenetrable armor. Jedediah swung his axe, the blade glancing off the creature's thick hide with a useless, metallic clang. The serpent turned its massive, reptilian head towards him, its mouth gaping open in a menacing hiss, fangs as long as daggers. This was not just a battle for a horse. This was a battle for the last piece of his heart. And as he prepared to swing again, he knew he was facing a monster born from a nightmare. But to understand the fire in this man's eyes, to know why this one horse meant more to him than his own life, we must go back to a time before the silence. 3 years earlier, the world of Jedediah Stone was not one of silence and survival, but of vibrant, joyful noise. It was the sound of his wife, Elara, her laughter like the melody of a fiddle, her voice a constant, gentle hum as she tended her thriving garden, a splash of impossible color against the rugged landscape. Jedediah, a man whose hands were calloused from war and work, had found his peace not in the vast emptiness of the frontier, but in the small, warm circle of her arms. His homestead was not just a plot of land. It was a kingdom of two, built on a foundation of shared labor and a love so profound it seemed to make the very wildflowers grow brighter. He had believed his capacity for joy had been buried on the battlefield, but Elara had shown him otherwise. He cherished the simple, profound rituals of their life, the warmth of her hand in his, as they watched the sunset, the shared meals at their small, hand-carved wooden table, the quiet dreams they whispered to each other under a blanket of stars. He had his wife, his home, and his honor. He thought he had everything a man could ever ask for. On the morning of their first anniversary, Elara, her eyes dancing with a playful, secretive light, led him to the corral. There, waiting for him, was the most magnificent creature he had ever seen. A young stallion, his coat a brilliant, pure white that seemed to capture and hold the morning sun, his eyes dark and intelligent, his spirit proud and untamed. It was a gift of immense love, a creature of breathtaking beauty that she had used her entire inheritance to purchase from a renowned breeder. Every king needs a noble steed. He is a piece of the sky, a piece of the wind, a ghost of the wild. But he is yours now, my love. Protect him, and he will protect you. And so, he had named him Ghost. The horse was more than just an animal. He was a living, breathing symbol of their bright, boundless future. He was the promise of sons and daughters who would learn to ride on his strong back, of a legacy that would stretch across this land. Their life felt perfect, unshakable, blessed by a benevolent Sunday. But the frontier gives, and the frontier takes away with a cruel, indifferent swiftness. The winter fever came without warning, a silent, invisible thief riding on the cold winds. It crept into their home and stole the warmth from Elara's body, the light from her eyes. Jedediah fought for her with the desperation of a man watching his world burn for a second time. He nursed her, bathed her brow, and held her hand, whispering promises he knew he couldn't keep. The fever took her, and their infant son, born just a month prior, followed her into the great silence within the same sorrowful week. The silence that descended upon the homestead was absolute, a crushing, physical weight that suffocated all life and color. The laughter was gone, the love was gone. All that remained were the ghosts of a happy memory, and the one living creature that shared his profound grief. In the empty, hollow days that followed, Jedediah nearly let the silence take him too. But every morning, a soft, insistent whinny would come from the corral. It was Ghost. The horse, sensing his master's despair, would call to him, a steady, unwavering anchor in a sea of grief. Ghost was the last thing his wife had touched with love, the last gift she had given him. He was a four-legged ghost of a happier time. Jedediah would spend his days in the corral, leaning against the great white horse, his silent tears soaking into its soft mane. And the horse would simply stand, a patient, warm, and living monument to the love they had all shared. His steady presence was the only thing that kept the silence from swallowing Jedediah Stone whole. And now, on the muddy banks of the Serpent River, that last memory, that final, living piece of his heart, was being crushed to death. The warmth of the past evaporated, replaced by the icy, brutal reality of the present. The serpent tightened its coils, and Jed heard a terrible, sharp series of cracks from Ghost's body, the sound of ribs surrendering to the immense pressure. The horse let out a choked, agonized scream, a sound that ripped through Jed's soul and rekindled the white-hot fury in his veins. He would not lose again, not like this. He scrambled back, his mind racing, searching for another weapon, another option. He drew his pistol, the familiar weight of the Colt, a desperate comfort in his hands. He was a crack shot, a man who could hit a running rabbit from 100 yards. He aimed for the creature's head, a target that was weaving slowly, hypnotically, its attention still focused on its prey. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the quiet valley. The bullet struck the serpent's bony skull with a sharp ping, ricocheting harmlessly into the trees. He fired again, another ricochet. The creature's skull was like a shield of living stone, impervious to his modern weapons. For the first time, the monster reacted to him. Its great reptilian head, larger than a full-grown wolf, swiveled in his direction. Its eyes, ancient and devoid of any emotion save a cold, predatory hunger, fixed on him. With a furious, ear-splitting hiss that was the sound of nightmares, it released one of its coils from the horse and lunged. Jed had only a split second. He threw himself sideways, tumbling into the muddy, churning water of the riverbank, just as the snake's massive head struck the spot where he had been standing. Its fangs, as long as his own fingers, buried themselves deep in the earth with a sickening thud, leaving two deep, venomous-looking holes. The sheer, terrifying power of the strike left him breathless. This was not just a battle. It was an execution, and he was next. He knew he couldn't stay in the open. He scrambled back towards his discarded saddlebags, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had one last weapon, a heavy wood axe, its blade worn but sharp, a tool for felling trees, not for slaying monsters. As he retrieved it, the serpent dislodged its fangs from the earth and turned its cold, unblinking gaze back towards him. The battle had devolved into a desperate, hopeless stalemate. Jed, now armed with the axe, circled the thrashing creatures, his boots sinking into the mud, his mind a whirlwind of frantic, desperate calculations. He looked for an opening, a weakness, any vulnerable spot, but the snake was a fortress of muscle and scale. It kept its head protected, tucked low behind the suffocating wall of its own coils, while its massive body continued its slow, brutal work on his horse. Ghost's struggles were growing weaker, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps, his beautiful white coat now stained with mud and his own blood. He was losing. Time was running out. Jed was a soldier. He was a hunter. He had faced down armed men and charging bears. He understood the grim logic of violence. But this was different. This creature was not just an animal. It felt ancient, primal, a force of nature that defied all his experience. He was a man with an axe, facing a living, breathing mountain of muscle and death. Despair, a feeling he knew all too well, a feeling he had lived with for 3 long years, began to creep back into his heart. He was going to lose the last thing he loved in the world, and he was utterly, completely powerless to stop it. He was failing to protect Ghost, just as he had failed to protect Ilera and his son. The past and present were merging into one, single, horrifying failure. The stalemate was a slow-motion nightmare. Jedediah circled the periphery of the deadly dance, his axe held ready, his mind screaming for a solution that his body could not provide. Every desperate plan he conceived crumbled before it could even form. A direct charge was suicide. Trying to cut through the thick coils was a fool's errand that would take far too long, and every second was precious. He could only watch, a helpless spectator at the execution of his only friend. Ghost's struggles were now barely perceptible. His beautiful white body going limp, his breath a faint, almost inaudible whisper against the mud. Jed felt a cold, familiar grief begin to wash over him. The same hollow ache that had been his constant companion for 3 long years. He was losing again. He was failing to protect the one thing he had sworn on his wife's grave to keep safe. He leaned against a tree, his own breath ragged, the heavy axe feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. He was ready to give up. The thought was a bitter poison, a final surrender to a cruel and unforgiving world. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the final, heartbreaking silence. It was in that moment of near surrender, as he forced his eyes open for one last look, that he saw it. It was a small detail, something his frantic, adrenaline-fueled mind had previously overlooked, something that didn't fit the narrative of a predator and its prey. The serpent, for all its immense power and focus on crushing Ghost, was behaving erratically. It wasn't just constricting, it was writhing, its massive body spasming in a way that seemed unnatural. It wasn't the calm, calculated pressure of a hunter. It was the frenzied, uncontrolled rage of a creature in agony. A new thought, a wild and improbable idea, sparked in Jed's mind. What if the horse wasn't the only one in pain? The thought shifted his perspective entirely. He was no longer just fighting a monster. He was trying to understand it. He began to watch, truly watch, not as a combatant, but as a tracker, reading the signs. He saw the way the serpent's movements were clumsy, almost drunken. He saw the way one side of its body seemed to favor the other, a subtle imbalance in its immense power. And then, during a particularly violent spasm, as the creature shifted its massive coils, he saw the source of its agony. There, on its underside, partially hidden by a thick fold of muscle and scale, was a wound. It was not a fresh wound from his own futile attacks. It was an old, festering injury. The flesh around it was swollen and discolored, and protruding from the center, dark and ugly, was the splintered wooden shaft of a large, broken spear or harpoon. It was a grievous, deeply embedded wound, a source of constant, excruciating pain that had clearly been tormenting the creature for weeks, driving it mad. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. The creature's frenzied rage, its clumsy attacks, its overwhelming aggression. It was not malice. It was pain. It was a wounded beast, lashing out at a world it perceived only as a source of its suffering. It had attacked Ghost not out of hunger, but because the horse had unknowingly trespassed into the territory of a creature driven insane by agony. A cold, calculated strategy began to form in Jedediah's mind. He now had a new target, not the creature's impenetrable hide or its bony skull. His new target was its pain. He didn't know if his theory was right, but it was the only new idea he'd had since the fight began. He had to get a closer look at that wound. He had to understand the weapon that had caused it. It was a terrible, dangerous gamble, to move closer to the source of the beast's fury. But it was the only one he had left. The soldier in him saw a tactical opportunity. But the man in him, the man who had known his own deep, festering wounds, felt a flicker of something he never expected to feel for this monster. A profound, tragic pity. Jedediah's mind, honed by years of tracking and warfare, shifted into a state of hyper-focus. The immediate, chaotic violence of the battle faded into the background, replaced by the cold, clear logic of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The spearhead, the wound, these were the only clues that mattered now. He began to move again, not with the aggression of a fighter, but with the cautious, calculated steps of a detective approaching a crime scene. He needed a closer look, a risk that sent a fresh jolt of ice-cold fear through his veins. But it was a risk he had to take. He moved in a wide, slow arc, keeping his body low, never taking his eyes off the serpent's massive head. The creature, still writhing in spasms of agony, was a whirlwind of unpredictable motion. Its tail lashed out, smashing a small boulder to pieces, a terrifying reminder of the power he was choosing to approach. He waited, his patience a form of armor, for a moment of relative calm. It came when the serpent, exhausted by another wave of pain, slumped momentarily, its great body shuddering. That was his chance. He darted in, his eyes scanning the festering wound, committing every detail to memory before scrambling back to a safe distance. The image was burned into his mind. The spearhead was not of native design. It was forged iron, but its shape was unique, wickedly barbed to cause maximum damage upon entry and to make removal nearly impossible. But it was the shaft that made his blood run cold. Even in its broken state, he could see the intricate, almost obsessive carvings near the base, a series of interlocking diamond patterns. It was a signature, a calling card. He had seen it only once before, years ago, in a saloon in a dusty border town. But it was a design he would never forget. It belonged to a man named Silas Kane. Kane was not just a hunter. He was a collector of the rare and the monstrous, a man whose wealth allowed him to indulge in the cruelest of sports. He was a legend in the territories, known for two things: his unmatched skill in tracking the most dangerous creatures and his sadistic preference for using custom-made, slow-acting venom on his spearheads. He didn't just want to kill his prey. He wanted to watch it suffer, to break its spirit before he claimed its hide as a trophy. This was the plot twist, the horrifying, gut-wrenching truth of the scene before him. This colossal serpent, this magnificent, ancient creature, was not a monster. It was a victim of a man's cruel sport. It was dying. The venom, a neurotoxin Kane was infamous for, was slowly, agonizingly, paralyzing it from the inside out. The frenzied rage, the violent spasms, it was the desperate last stand of a creature being consumed by a poison it could not fight. It wasn't trying to kill Ghost out of malice. It was simply lashing out at anything that moved, its powerful body, a prisoner to the storm of pain and confusion raging within its dying brain. The entire nature of the conflict had changed in an instant. This was no longer a battle of man versus beast. This was a race against time, a desperate attempt to save two lives from two different poisons. Ghost was being crushed to death by the serpent's coils, and the serpent was being eaten alive from within by Silas Kane's venom. Jedediah stood between them, the horrified witness to a double execution. A profound, tragic empathy for the great serpent welled up inside him, an emotion so strange and powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He was looking at one of the most powerful creatures he had ever seen, and he saw in its agony a reflection of his own slow, internal death by the poison of grief. He knew then, with a terrible, unshakable certainty, that he could not just kill this creature. To do so would be to finish Kane's cruel work for him. It would be an act of mercy, yes, but it would not be an act of justice. He had to find another way, a way to save them both. The revelation left Jedediah paralyzed in a state of horrified empathy. He was no longer a combatant in a simple fight for survival. He was now the unwilling arbiter of a complex, tragic drama. The path forward, the one that screamed logic and self-preservation, was brutally clear. Do nothing. Wait. The serpent was dying. Sooner or later, the venom would finish its work. The great coils would go slack, and Ghost would be freed. It was the soldier's choice, the strategist's choice. Wait for your enemy to destroy itself. But as he watched, another wave of agonizing spasms racked the serpent's body. The coils around Ghost tightened convulsively, and his horse let out another choked, gurgling cry, a sound that was getting weaker, closer to silence. Jedediah's blood ran cold. The serpent might take hours to die, but Ghost only had minutes. Waiting was not an option. Waiting was a death sentence for his friend. He was trapped in a moral crucible. To save Ghost, he had to get closer to the serpent. But to get closer to the serpent, in its current state of frenzied, unpredictable agony, was suicide. He gripped the handle of his axe, his knuckles white. The old Jedediah, the soldier, would have charged in. He would have used the creature's pain distraction to his advantage, aiming for its head, its neck, ending the threat with brutal efficiency. It would be a mercy killing, a swift end to the serpent's slow, agonizing demise. He could justify it. It was logical. It was necessary. He took a step forward, his muscles coiling, preparing for the final, deadly strike. But he stopped. The image of his wife, Ilara, flashed in his mind. He remembered her boundless compassion, the way she would nurse a fallen bird back to health, the way she believed every creature had a right to its own life, free from pain. To kill this tormented mother, this victim of a sadist's cruel game, felt like a betrayal of her memory. It felt like finishing Silas Kane's sick, twisted hunt for him. He looked at the serpent, not as a monster, but as a fellow creature in its final, desperate moments, and he saw a reflection of his own tormented soul. He could not bring himself to be its executioner. A new idea, an insane, impossible, and utterly selfless thought began to form in his mind. What if he wasn't its executioner? What if he was its surgeon? What if the only way to save Ghost was to save the serpent from its own agony first? The thought was madness. To approach a dying, thrashing, colossal serpent not with a weapon, but with the intent to perform a delicate, dangerous operation. It was a plan that defied all reason. But it was the only plan that felt right. It was the only path that honored both his love for his horse and the newfound, tragic respect he felt for its captor. This was his all-in moment. The moment he chose not the path of a soldier, but the path of a healer. He took his heavy axe, the symbol of his violent intent, and deliberately, with a loud clang, threw it into the river. He then unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall to the muddy ground. He was now unarmed, vulnerable, an act of ultimate, insane trust. He held up his empty hands and began to walk slowly, cautiously, towards the writhing mass of muscle and scale. He began to speak, his voice low and calm, the same soothing murmur he had used to calm Ghost in his moments of fear. He was not speaking to a monster. He was speaking to a mother. He told her he understood her pain. He told her he was not there to harm her, but to help. The serpent watched him approach, its great head rising, its hiss a low, warning rumble. But the frenzied thrashing seemed to lessen slightly, its ancient eyes filled with a confused, cautious curiosity. Jedediah did not stop. He was gambling everything, his life, his horse's life, on the hope that this ancient creature, in its final moments, could understand not just the language of violence, but the language of a shared, parental desperation. He had chosen his path. He would be a protector, not a destroyer, and he would live or die by that choice. He was now just feet away from the festering wound and from the serpent's deadly fangs. The final confrontation was not a clash of violence, but a terrifyingly delicate dance on the razor's edge of death. Jedediah was now within the serpent's striking distance, his every movement slow, deliberate, his voice a constant, soothing murmur. The great creature watched him, its massive head swaying slightly, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the air, its ancient mind clearly struggling to process this strange, unarmed human who spoke the language of peace. Ghost's ragged breathing was a constant, desperate metronome, counting down the final seconds of his life. Jed reached the festering wound. It was worse up close. The flesh was swollen and angry, and the dark, carved shaft of Silas Kane's harpoon was buried deep within the creature's side. He knew that pulling it out would cause an explosion of agony, a reaction that would surely be lethal. He had to be fast. He had to be precise. He placed one hand gently on the serpent's scaly hide, a gesture of reassurance, and with the other, he gripped the splintered wood. He braced himself, took a deep breath, and pulled. A sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a high-pitched, screaming hiss, erupted from the serpent. Its body convulsed in a massive, violent spasm. The coils around Ghost tightened one last, brutal time, and the horse went completely limp, a final, shuddering breath escaping its lungs. For a horrifying second, Jed thought he had failed, that his act of compassion had delivered the final death blow. The serpent's massive head whipped around, its fangs bared, ready to strike him down. But the strike never came. As the harpoon came free, a torrent of dark, venomous blood poured from the wound, and with it, the source of the creature's torment was gone. The frenzied, insane rage in its eyes faded, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion. The violent spasms ceased, and the great coils, the instruments of death, went slack, uncoiling from Ghost's lifeless-looking body. The serpent, its energy spent, collapsed, its massive head resting on the muddy ground, its breathing slow and deep. It was not dead, but it was defeated, not by violence, but by an act of impossible empathy. Jed did not waste a moment. He scrambled to Ghost's side, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He pressed his ear to the horse's chest, praying, pleading. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing, and then he felt it. A single, faint, fluttering beat, followed by another. Ghost was alive. Barely. The serpent's coils had been released just in time. Jed spent the next hour tending to his friend, cleaning his wounds, forcing water past his lips. His hands gentle, his voice a constant stream of reassurance. He knew, without looking, that the great serpent was watching him. There was no threat between them now, only a shared, exhausted peace on a battlefield where no one had truly won. 3 months later, Jedediah and Ghost stood on a high ridge, looking down at the Serpent River. Ghost was fully healed, the memory of his ordeal visible only in a few pale scars that crisscrossed his magnificent white coat. Jedediah had never returned to that specific bend in the river. It was a sacred place now, a place he respected as another's home. He had not just won a battle that day. He had learned a profound lesson that had reshaped his very soul. He had learned that the line between man and monster is sometimes blurred by pain, and that the fiercest battles are often fought by those who are simply trying to protect their family. He looked at his own friend, his only family, and felt a quiet, contented peace he had not known since before the fever had stolen his wife and son. As they turned to leave, he saw a flicker of movement by the river's edge far below. He raised his spyglass, his hands steady. It was the great serpent mother. She was no longer a creature of agony, but one of majestic grace, her massive body gliding effortlessly through the water. And slithering behind her, making their clumsy, first journey from the hidden crevice into the wide, welcoming river, were dozens of tiny, newly hatched snakes. Her family was safe, and so was his. Jedediah lowered his spyglass, a deep, genuine smile gracing his features for the first time in 3 long years. He had faced a monster from a nightmare and had discovered not an enemy, but a fellow guardian. He had not taken a life, he had saved 2. In the heart of the wild, he had not lost a friend. He had found a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to protect the ones you love, and in doing so, he had finally, truly, begun to heal himself.